All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel, and thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel, and we try to hook you up with info about things that you probably have never heard of before, but if you did, they would affect your life in profound ways. We've been doing a lot of Bible decodes coming from the New Testament. I think this is number 166, and for quite a while now we've been going over this new book from Menasgotz, Menasgotz, and it's called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians were a dynasty of Caesars that ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And according to Menasgotz and also the broader Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament from many other authors, including Bruno Bauer and James Ballantyne Hannay, Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin, Henry Davis, Joseph Atwill, James Valiant, and now Michael Menasgotz, Cliff Carrington, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two, but they all have been writing about how the Romans wrote the New Testament, or parts of it, and Menasgotz does the same. The basic idea is that Vespasian and his son Titus both were veterans of the war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. They were both wounded in that war, and they were both very tired of dealing with the militancy of the Jews. That they were always revolting and uprising and revoluting and insurrecting, and they were also, both Vespasian and Titus were beginning their reigns, their dynasty in Rome, and they wanted to really solidify what they had, knowing that a Jewish revolt could be right around the corner, even though that Titus and Vespasian utterly decimated the Jewish resistance in this war and completely tore Jerusalem to shreds. But still, they felt they needed to tame or domesticate or prune or pacify the Jews. The Jews had this monotheistic religion with a jealous and zealous God, who also had a number of other personality quirks, such as obsessive compulsive disorder and a serious addiction to smoking animal fat, and also very indecisive and again, obsessive compulsive, just putting a lot of different rules on his chosen people and branding them with that idea, so they became xenophobic and separatists. The Romans just wanted wanted to absorb you into the Roman Empire. And they pulled into Judea in about 63 BC. And so this had been going on for over 100 years now. And so finally, I think what is kind of important is that Titus was unable to get the Jews to call him Lord. They refused to do that. They would rather die first. And I think that also had a lot to do with the motivation here for the Romans to write the New Testament, because they basically wrote themselves into the Jewish tradition as the gods of particularly Titus, as the God that inherited the Jewish tradition, the second coming of Jesus. And so that's what happened. They wrote the New Testament, at least the Gospels, and backdated them by 40 years. And then they wrote a history of the war between the Jews and the Romans. That is called Jewish War. And they wrote that under the name of Josephus. And whether Josephus existed or not is a bone of contention, but it is unmistakable that Josephus emanated from the Roman Caesar's palace. He was, according to his autobiography, a court historian for the Flavians and lived in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and was an adopted member of the Flavian royal family. He is known as Flavius Josephus. And if you read Josephus's work, you will see unmistakable parallels between Josephus and the New Testament, such that you have to conclude that whoever Josephus was, whether that's a team of scholars or one person or a family or whoever it was, they also wrote the New Testament. And they parallel each other and parody each other in so many different places that it goes beyond coincidental. In particular, Joseph Atwill uncovered the Flavian signature, where he looked into the book of Luke and found that Jesus had a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus had a 3-year military campaign in Judea. Every place, according to War of the Jews, and every place that War of the Jews documents Titus went, the battles that he fought and the other, different dramas that he faced. Every place that Titus went, Jesus also went. In the same order. Atwill documents over 40 episodes of them going to the same place in the same order. And then what happens to Titus is a parallel of what happens to Jesus, conceptually parallel. Not exactly the same events, but parallel events at each location. And each event is separated by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. So that is one family of parallels between, in this case, the book of Luke and Jewish war. There are many others. Many of the prophecies in the Gospels that Jesus makes are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews. And many of them are fulfilled by Titus, making Titus the second coming of Jesus. And so this gospel business was a way that Titus could get the Jews to call him Lord without them even knowing it. Now, they also targeted it toward the Gentiles, the slaves, and the soldiers in Rome. I think that, to me, that was more the Pauline epistles. But Menasgotz has slightly different ideas about that. We'll get into that. Now, what Menasgotz does is he digs further into the book of Luke and looks for even more parallels than what Atwill found. And he found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke between Luke and Jewish war. And again, the parallels go back and forth. They're not just going in one direction. It's not that Josephus is parodying Luke. Sometimes Luke is parodying Josephus, quite often. And so they were written as companion pieces. They bounce off each other, written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. Menasgotz found over 250 of these parallels that he's gone through in this book. Some of the parallels are rather trivial and could easily be dismissed as coincidental by themselves. Some of the parallels are so powerful that they will literally knock your socks off with the level of detail and the skill with which they were written and well hidden within the text, where you're just looking at like 4 or 5 lines of text and there's like 12 parallels between the two, such that you even just by itself, it goes beyond coincidental that it's there. And so there's 250 of them. And not only that, but Menasgotz also graphed them on a chart. The book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Wherever he found a parallel, he plotted the point on a 2-dimensional chart. And after he plotted all 250 points, he has constructed 5 perfect letters, near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, Latin being the language of the Romans, the Caesars. Latin was really kind of an elite Roman language, whereas Greek was the more common language in Rome. Now, the New Testament is written in Greek, as is Josephus, and Greek was pretty rare in Judea, where Jesus, had he existed, and his apostles would have been speaking in Aramaic and writing in Hebrew or Aramaic, most likely. But the New Testament is in Greek, and that's where we're going to resume here, going over. Menasgotz is kind of summing up his thesis here at the end of the book, and he's giving you a large number of points about the explanatory power of his thesis. And I agree wholeheartedly. The Roman origins hypothesis explains so many things that are left to God in the Gospels, where Christian apologists, well, there's no explanation for this, so it must be that God did it. And it's like, well, no, it's just that you haven't considered that the Romans did it. The Romans could have done it quite a bit easier than God did it, and according to Occam's razor. So anyway, he's at point number 11, which is, it explains why the Gospels are in Koine Greek, or I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, Koine, which is a kind of folky kind of Greek from this time period. It also explains why the Gospels are in a language that Jesus wouldn't have spoken. By showing that Luke and Jewish war were intended to be read together, it follows that it needed to be in the same language. Latin was an unacceptable choice for Luke, as it would have betrayed its Roman origin. Conversely, Hebrew and Aramaic were unacceptable choices for publishing Jewish war across the empire. Thus, Greek is the obvious compromise, or rather Koine Greek, which was the common form of Greek between 300 BC and 300 AD. Number 12, it explains the purpose of Jesus' story. It was written to drive the Jews, Gentiles, and legions of the empire to worship the Roman emperor and pay their taxes, thereby cementing the Flavians' hold on the throne, ensuring the economic success of the empire with the aim of sustaining Flavian rule for generations. Number 13, it explains a huge number of parables and details of Jesus' story. Merely as examples, it explains why Jesus tells Simon that he will be dragged to his death and should feed his four-legged beasts, why another Simon is made to lead Jesus' procession to Golgotha, why Golgotha is described as the place of the skull. It is a parody of the triumph of arriving at the Capitoline that was named after a skull. It explains why Jesus refers to Jerusalem as a den of thieves and talks to the devil upon Jerusalem's holy house. Why John is described as having a devil. Why it is he who says he should be plunged into the river Jordan by Jesus. Because this is a parody of Titus drowning John's forces in that river. That's a different John, John the Jewish zealot that was one of the uprisers in this war that Titus was in. Why Jesus sends pigs to drown in the Jordan for the same reason. Why Jesus descends into the earth and defeats death at Jerusalem. Why Jesus' story keeps mentioning Hades rather than hell. Because Jerusalem was intended to be equated with Hades. It explains why Jesus described a Samaritan when asked who you should love, why he fed the 4,000 and 5,000, leaving 12 baskets full, why he healed the slave without going into the house, why he offers an ambiguous liberty to leave, why he repeatedly bends down and up when they contemplate stoning an adulteress, why he resurrected Lazarus, why the doubting twin Thomas went to die with Lazarus, why John and Acts contain so many triangle numbers, and indeed those particular triangle numbers. It explains why Jesus talked of a good Samaritan and of men becoming eunuchs for kings and letting them receive it, and why Jesus is rebuked for touching children, and much more besides. Number 14, it explains why the Romans have been thought of as expert strategists, but strangely mute on propaganda. By showing Josephus to be fictional, this shows that several prominent writers were propaganda outlets, or the government chose to publish works falsely in their names. And the reality is that the Romans were so good at propaganda that we have been unable to detect which writings were in fact propaganda. I think Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin have really shed a lot of light on that really everything that was being put out by the first century Romans was propaganda. And much of it had, pseudonyms and fake names and fake people and obscure people who they made famous, and nicknames and contracted names. Arius Piso, according to Roman Piso, used 20 or 30 different aliases, and they explain these things in the letters that they wrote amongst each other. And so that was really a lot of the contribution that Sir Ronald Syme at Oxford made in the early to mid 20th century, is that he went into a lot of these letters, especially the letters of Pliny the Younger, and broke them down to try to break the code of all of the different names that each one of them would use. But really, it's a big blow to Western civilization, because Josephus is like kind of the linchpin to ancient history. I mean, almost all ancient historians cite Josephus because he's like the only person who's writing history in the late 1st century. It's the Gospels and Josephus. And if you are, if it's determined that Josephus is the writer of the Gospels and neither of them existed, they were all just, agents of Rome, that really tears apart our understanding of 1st century history completely. And then into that vacuum comes the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I can't say I know what to make of that because I can't say that they're for sure legitimate either, especially given their history of how it took 40 years or more for their content to really be released to the public. We went over that in the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, probably about 150 videos ago, if you want to check into that Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. Okay, this is claim number 15. It explains why the Romans were claimed to have persecuted early Christians. It explains why so many writers over the following centuries who had no first-hand knowledge of it made unsupported claims that the Romans persecuted early Christians. Therefore, to make it hard for anyone to imagine that the Romans created the Jesus story. And that a lot of that, again, is in Candida Moss's book on the, I can't remember the title, but it basically is showing that Christian persecution was super exaggerated. And that most of the persecution in the 1st century of Romans was Romans persecuting Jews, not Christians, where there's kind of a semi-permeable membrane between Jews and Christians at this time, because just look at some of the debates that are being had in the Pauline epistles, where Paul is talking about how the religion needs to be open to Gentiles, but people like Peter are totally against that. And they think it still should be, we still need to maintain our Jewish traditions and our rituals, our circumcision and all of that. So, these are some of the people that are being executed, possibly. They're really Jews. They're not Christians yet. Okay, it explains why Josephus, now again, Paul didn't exist and either did Peter. So, this is just all, hypotheticals that are coming from the Gospels or from the New Testament. Okay, it explains why Josephus' story is so bizarrely impossible. It explains why Josephus is described as the supreme Jewish military and religious leader, despite no contemporary Judean records mentioning this, who Vespasian and Titus defeated and then befriended, despite it being their culture to execute him publicly in the triumph in Rome. It explains why he gave their enemy permission to, why the Romans gave their enemy permission to write their account of their crowning achievement, including how they defeated him. The explanation being because the Roman government wanted to present a model for Jews to emulate. Okay, let's move on to the next page here, if possible. Okay, there's about 6 or 7 more explanatory power explanations here. It explains why Jesus' story would not only parallel Titus's story, this being to enable the temples to lead followers to see Titus as the second coming of Jesus, but also why Josephus' own story would parody Jesus' story back. This being so Josephus, Matthias, could be revealed as both a Hebrew anagram of piso and a pun on mighty or mega, Arius, Arios, or Aries, as part of an effort to mislead the followers that Emperor Titus, who was to be worshipped as Aries Piso Titus, had personally written the Gospels, thereby helping convince them of his divinity. And again, it's very important to keep in mind that according to the Roman Senate, both Vespasian and Titus were deified. So they literally were gods, along with a few other Caesars, Augustus and Julius and Claudius. They were all deified, so they literally were gods. The Romans created a number of religions in the first century. So this is not out of left field. This is right down their alley, right in their MO. So in addition to the motive, they had the method, they had the opportunity. They really are the only people who had the opportunity, because they had a 100% censorship, blanket, as well as they were the only people that had enough slave scribes to be copying these texts all day long and coming up with thousands of copies. And they had a monopoly on the postal service, so distribution. Okay, number 18, it explains why Tacitus and other writers just happened to mention knowing Josephus in person, indeed in private correspondence that just happened to become widely circulated. This being because the Flavian government had a need to convince the Jewish population that Josephus was real, and forcing someone like Tacitus to write letters to that effect, or indeed producing them without his permission, was a trivially easy way to achieve that. It explains a host of other literature. Explains, for example, why Pliny the Younger lies about the date of the eruption of Vesuvius. I didn't know that. To place it closer to Titus's inauguration. Yeah, so Vespasian died just before Vesuvius, and then so Titus took over in 79. I know Pliny the Elder was killed in Vesuvius, but not Vespasian. Okay, so to make it closer to Titus's inauguration via a letter to Tacitus, it explains why the plays of Shakespeare are obsessed with Roman narratives and full of unexplained metaphor that can be interpreted as mocking a Flavian origin of Christianity. Why the Jewish Talmud mocks the creation of Christianity and appears to refer to Aries and Arius Piso. Why Celsus referred to a Roman father of Jesus, and why Marcion these are both 2nd century writers, and why Marcion claimed Jesus represented an unknown God who wasn't the Jewish God, and that Luke was the only true gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell basically the same story, but it's only Luke that tells it in the order where Titus is in sync with Jesus, so that you can see that they're going to the same places in the same order, and that they're really that the 3-year ministry of Jesus is a copy of the 3-year military campaign of Titus. It explains the Essene sect and the lack of evidence it existed. It explains why Jewish war describes and praises an Essene sect without ever stating that their God and the legislator they honor are the Jewish ones. Why all three sources claiming knowledge of it are so closely linked to Emperor Titus. I think that's Philo, Pliny, and Josephus are the only three people who've ever mentioned the Essenes before. Why the Essene philosophy matches Jesus' teachings, and why its practices are at odds with being Jewish and incompatible with the Passover ritual. Why it has a social hierarchy with specifically 4 levels. It is a model of the 4-tier secrecy cult that the Flavians plan to establish. Why the sources refuse to give specific locations where the Essene lived, and why there is no physical evidence for the Essene, with, for example, Qumran's, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. For example, Qumran's library of religious scrolls not even mentioning the Essenes. It explains this strange behavior of Emperor Constantine and the early Catholic Church. It explains why Constantine went to such lengths to convince people that Jesus was historical, even announcing his mother found Jesus' cross and that the nails still possessed power over the elements, and why he supposedly convened the Council of Nicaea to address a blasphemy of Arius, in quotes, and then spent his entire life suppressing it. Yet what little is explained about this blasphemy does not suggest it would have been a threat to him. It also explains why the early Catholic Church was famously paranoid, why it only made the Bible available in a language none of its peoples could read. It explains why the Gospels would contain the exact evidence required to prove that they were created by the Flavian royal government, this being to enable the temples of Titus's secrecy cult to reveal this under oath of secrecy, thereby convincing dual Jesus-Titus worshippers to become pure Flavian emperor worshippers. But these discoveries, such as the APTVS pattern, aren't academic. They matter greatly, and for 2 reasons. The first reason why these discoveries matter. One reason it matters has to do with the historicity of Josephus Flavius, which Jewish War states was its author, and whose utterly implausible story is generally accepted by most modern historians as fact. By showing the APTVS pattern is real and that so many of its parallels involve Flavius Josephus's